In the dead of an Alaskan winter, Sam Whitaker thought he'd seen every kind of cold. But on the coldest morning yet, the knock at his door wasn't from a human. It was the tap of claws. On his porch stood a shivering mother bobcat with her young, her eyes cutting through the frost in a plea for help. The moment Sam opened the door, an extraordinary story between man and wild began. Chapter 1. Record cold winds. The porch thermometer had frozen at the bottom of its glass tube, but the radio kept repeating the number anyway. 50 below. Not wind chill. Air itself. The kind of cold that made boards creak like old ships and turned breath to powder. Sam Whitaker fed a split log into the iron stove and shut the door with a careful hand, listening to the stove tick as it swallowed the wood. Heat pushed out in slow waves, touching his cheeks, easing the stiffness in his knuckles. Outside, the wind dragged its sleeve across the roof and moaned along the eaves, a long, hollow sound that felt older than the mountain. He lifted a chipped mug from the stovetop and let the steam rise into his mustache before he sipped. Coffee and wood smoke, a storm day's two good comforts. He had cords of dry spruce stacked under the shed roof. Jars of stew and beans lined on the pantry shelf, and nowhere he needed to be. 58 years had lightened his calendar and deepened the quiet. The cabin held the things that lasted: Mary's braided rug, a quilt folded square on the rocker, a map of the ridge thumbtacked above the table. In weather like this, he kept to small chores and long stretches by the fire, trusting routine to keep the mind steady. The window panes thrummed as the wind rose again. Sam crossed the room and rubbed a small clear circle in the frost with the side of his fist. The yard had dissolved into a bright, shifting blur. Snow corkscrewed through the clearing, chasing its own tail. The spruce stood thick and dark under the weight of it, shoulders hunched like old men in heavy coats. Somewhere beyond the white, the creek ran under ice with a sound like whispering. Something tapped, quick and light, against the door. He held still. The sound came again. Not a random scrape or the sag of a shutter. It had rhythm. He set the mug down and moved to the entry, listening the way he used to listen in the bush, when a small noise could mean a big problem. The tapping stopped, only the wind. He reached for the latch and paused, feeling the prickle along his forearms. He told himself it was a loose hook or a branch. Then the tap returned, 2 quick touches and a longer one, almost polite. "All right," he said, his voice a steadying weight. "Let's have a look." He slid on his gloves, lifted the latch, and eased the door open an inch. The cold shoved its way in, sharp enough to bite. Snow blew across the threshold in glittering threads. He leaned his shoulder into the door and pushed it a foot wide. At first, there was only brightness. Then the shape at the sill took form. A bobcat, small for an adult, narrow with winter, fur rimed in ice. She stood just outside, not crouched to spring, not flattened to flee, but held in a careful stillness. Her ears wore white caps of snow. Frost grained the whiskers along her fine-boned face. She breathed in hard little puffs that hung in the air. Her eyes were amber and steady on his, not asking, not daring, simply fixed. Behind her, pressed into the slight shelter of the step, lay 3 kits. 2 were bundled together in a tight knot, shivering under a sift of snow. The third lay on its side, a small, spotted curl of fur that barely rose and fell. The mother turned, quick and exact, and took that limp kit in her mouth by the scruff. She stepped forward, slow as a prayer, set the kit's paws over the threshold onto the worn floorboards, and drew back again to the edge of the storm. For a heartbeat, 5 breaths showed white in the doorway. Hers, the kit's, and his. Threads of life twining and fading. Sam's rules lined up in his head like fence posts. You don't invite wild animals into a house. You don't teach them that doors open. You don't put your hands on a problem with teeth. He had carried those rules through hard winters and long seasons guiding men with more money than sense. But there is a moment in some choices when the weight of not acting presses heavier than the risk. The kit made a thin, frayed sound that seemed to tug at him physically, like a string at his chest. "Easy," he said, though he couldn't say to whom. He crouched, bracing one hand on the jamb, the other palm open, empty, low. The mother did not step back. She watched him with a quiet so complete it felt like another kind of noise. Snow needled the gap around his legs. Cold stung his eyes. He slid his bare hand under the kit. The fur was wet at the roots. The tiny body felt lighter than it should have, as if the cold had stolen weight with heat. He expected a slap of claws, a flash of teeth, a sound. None came. The mother's eyes stayed on his hand, bright and still. He gathered the kit against his chest, rose, and backed into the cabin. The door swung shut, and the latch found home with a homely click. The storm's voice fell away to a muffled roar. He set the kit on the braided rug in the bright oval of the stove's heat and knelt close. He rubbed its legs and ribs with his palms, gentle and brisk, talking in the low, even tone you use for skittish colts and scared children. Warmth is a slow traveler. The little chest lifted in shallow beats. He worked without hurry, because hurry breaks things, and without pause, because pause in this case might cost. At the door, a shadow moved. He looked up. 2 rounder shapes hovered in the frost on the glass. He crossed the room in 3 long steps and opened the door just enough to join the 2 worlds again. The mother stood a pace closer than before. The other kits tucked against her like small, living shadows. She held his gaze, and he did a foolish thing. He nodded, as if there were rules of courtesy to be kept. The 2 kits slipped past his boots like wind-blown leaves and padded toward the heat. The mother waited 1 breath longer, reading the room, reading him, then shook a small storm of ice from her shoulders and came inside. Snow fell in stars onto the boards. He shut the door and let the hush settle. The stove ticked. The kettle lifted its lid and put it back. He took Mary's wool blanket from the rocker and made a rough nest beside the stove. Thick, warm, familiar. The mother guided her kits onto it with her body, settled them with licks and small nudges, the matter-of-fact tenderness of a creature who has done this before and will do it again. Sam returned to the smallest one, trading the blanket's heat for his hands, the mother's rough tongue adding its steady rasp. Between them, a thread of warmth began to hold. The room changed in ways he could feel but not name. The chairs and tables stayed where they were. The map still showed the old trail over the shoulder of Elk Ridge. The same scratches marked the floorboards where Mary's rocker had lived for years. But the center of gravity had shifted to that circle of firelight where 4 lives leaned toward heat. Sam felt his jaw unclench and didn't remember clamping it. He breathed out and found that breath had weight. He kept his distance enough to honor the line the mother drew, close enough to help. He fed a small piece of wood into the stove rather than a big one, because steady heat heals better than a flare. The kit's ear flicked, A tiny sound trembled in its throat. One of the other kits lifted its head, blinked as if waking from a too long nap, and tucked itself tighter against the mother's belly. The mother glanced at Sam then, just a touch of her eyes, and back to her work. Outside, the wind worried the world like a dog with a bone. Inside, warmth moved inch by inch through a small body and settled in. Sam sat back on his heels and wrapped his cold fingers around the cooling mug. Not to drink, just to hold something. He told himself he had simply done what a man does when trouble comes to the door and looks him in the face. The rest could be sorted later. For now, he would keep the fire steady, keep his voice low, and wait with them while the worst of the storm passed. Chapter 2. A strange silhouette at the window. The storm kept pressing its weight against the cabin as if it meant to test the walls. Sam stayed near the stove, half crouched, rubbing the smallest kit between his palms, feeling the slow spread of warmth as its tiny muscles twitched. The other two kits were already curled into the wool blanket, the mother having nudged them close to her belly. Every so often, she'd stretch her neck to check the one in his hands, her eyes following each movement without blinking. He could feel her trust hanging in the air, like something fragile. He didn't move quick or talk loud. Years of guiding hunters and tracking game had taught him the patience to let a creature read you before it decided which way to run. Now, in this close room, with the wind pulling at the eaves and snow ghosting past the frosted glass, that patience seemed like the only thing that mattered. After a while, the smallest kit's breathing deepened. Its paws, limp before, began to curl ever so slightly against his fingers. Sam eased it onto the blanket beside its siblings, and the mother instantly bent to it, rasping its fur with her tongue, working life back in with the steady rhythm of instinct. The sound of her grooming was soft, but carried clearly over the stove's hum, the same way a lullaby will carry over a quiet fire. Sam stood, stretching the stiffness from his knees, and stepped to the window. He rubbed another small circle clear in the frost, peering out toward the tree line. The storm was thicker now, the forest reduced to shifting shapes, but there, half lost in the white, was movement. At first, he thought it was just a fir branch bowing under new snow. Then the shape straightened, thin and deliberate. A man, or at least a man-sized shadow moving slowly along the far edge of the clearing. The figure paused, maybe looking toward the cabin. Sam's pulse picked up, and not from the cold. Out here, on a day like this, you didn't expect to see anyone without reason, and most reasons weren't good. The mother bobcat's head lifted at the same moment, her ears flicking forward. She stared toward the same patch of white as if she could see through it. Sam let the curtain fall back into place, mind working over possibilities. Nearest neighbor, Lucy Harper, was a quarter-mile down the track. No one else had reason to be this close, not unless they were lost or looking for something. A memory stirred. Last fall, before the snow, he'd heard gunshots too close to the property line. Not the kind of shots you took for deer, short bursts, careless angles. Someone had been running a trap line without permission. He wondered if whoever that was had decided to work the winter too. The mother gave a low, almost inaudible growl, her breath misting in the warm air. Sam spoke low to her, more for himself than for her. "Easy now. You've had enough trouble for one day." The shadow outside moved on, swallowed by the storm. But the prickle along his arms stayed. He crossed to the door, checking the latch, and added the crossbar just in case. He went back to the fire, added another log, and sat in the rocker with his hands folded. The mother bobcat's eyes followed him for a long moment, then softened back toward her kits. The smallest one had shifted so its head lay across her paw, its chest rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. A tap sounded again, faint but from a different place, the window this time. Sam rose and saw Lucy's face peering in, her scarf rimed with frost. He hurried to let her in, bracing against the gust that shoved past them. "Good Lord, Sam," she said, unwinding her scarf. "It's a whiteout out there. I came to check you hadn't frozen solid." Her eyes landed on the blanket by the stove, and her words stopped. "Is that—" "Bobcats," Sam said simply. "Came to the door, near froze to death." Lucy stepped closer, slow as if approaching a skittish patient. "I've never seen them inside a man's home like this." "They asked," Sam said, surprising himself with the truth of it, "in their way." Lucy knelt, holding her hands out near the blanket without touching. The mother bobcat watched her steadily, but didn't rise. "This little one here," Lucy said, nodding to the smallest kit, "wasn't going to last much longer. You got it in just in time." She dug into her coat pocket, pulling out a small jar. "Honey, warm a bit of this and see if it won't give them a kick." They worked side by side, Sam holding the kit, while Lucy dabbed a bit of warmed honey against its mouth. The tiny tongue flicked, hesitant, then again with more purpose. It wasn't much, but it was something. The mother bobcat leaned in close, scenting the air, then returned to her grooming. Outside, the storm didn't let up. The windows rattled now and then, and snow piled higher against the sills. The figure Sam had seen earlier never showed again, but his mind kept circling back to it, like a dog worrying a bone. Lucy stayed until the kettle whistled, and Sam poured them both coffee. They sat near the fire, steam rising between them, watching the small family rest. There was a comfort in the shared silence, in the soft sound of the mother's breathing, in the knowledge that, for the moment, the cold and whatever else was out there couldn't reach this circle of light. Sam felt the edges of the day shift, the way they sometimes do when you know you're in the middle of a story you'll be telling for the rest of your life. But there was something else under it too, a sense that the storm had brought more than snow to his door. Chapter 3. Eyes that ask for help. The storm didn't let up. By late afternoon, the light outside had settled into that dim gray that comes before true dark. It was the kind of light that turned the snow into a flat sheet of silver and made distance impossible to judge. Sam could barely see past the porch rail, but every time the wind lulled for a few seconds, he caught glimpses of the swirling curtain thinning just enough to reveal the ghostly outlines of the spruce and birch along the clearing's edge. Inside, the air was warm, the fire steady, the kettle sighing on the back of the stove. Lucy had gone an hour earlier, braving the narrow trail back to her own place, bundled so thick he could hardly see her eyes. Before she left, she'd made Sam promise to keep the smallest kit close to the fire and to give it another taste of honey every so often. He had kept his word. The little thing had taken more interest each time, licking his fingertip with a tiny pink tongue, eyes half closed as if the work of staying alive demanded all its focus. The mother bobcat hadn't moved far from her brood since the moment she'd come inside. Every few minutes she'd stand, stretch her lean frame, and pace a short circle around the blanket before settling again. It wasn't restlessness. Sam knew that much. It was the quiet vigilance of something that still wasn't sure the world wouldn't try to take her young again. When she looked at him, it was never casual. Those amber eyes fixed on his like a question he couldn't quite hear. They weren't the wide, startled eyes of an animal cornered, nor the flat, hard glare of a predator guarding a kill. There was weight in them, and something else, something he'd never expected to see in a wild creature. Trust was too big a word to claim just yet. But it was the start of it. Maybe. And under that, an echo of desperation. He found himself talking to her, without thinking about it, his voice pitched low, the way he might speak to a skittish horse. "You did right, bringing them here. We'll keep 'em warm. We'll keep 'em safe." The mother shifted, and the light caught the frost still clinging to her whiskers. He saw then how thin she'd grown. Winter in Alaska could carve the fat right off your bones if you didn't keep ahead of it. For a bobcat with 3 mouths to feed, the margin was knife-thin. He thought of the figure he'd seen in the storm earlier, and didn't like the mix of possibilities that came to mind. Another gust slammed against the cabin, rattling the stovepipe. The smallest kit stirred, lifting its head. The mother leaned down and licked between its ears, then looked back at Sam again, longer this time, as if holding him in place, her ears tipped forward. She stepped away from the blanket, padding across the rug toward the door, her paws making no sound on the boards. She stopped at the threshold and looked over her shoulder, her gaze flicking from him to the door latch and back. Sam understood. It was the same look his old shepherd dog had given him years ago when she'd wanted to show him something out in the yard. The same silent pull to follow. "You want me to—" He stopped himself. Talking to her like she'd answer wasn't crazy anymore. It was just what the day had made of him. He crossed to the door, unlatched it, and opened it a hand's width. The cold burst in like a fist, carrying needles of snow that stung his face. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped into the gap, holding her ground against the wind. Through the driving flakes, Sam could make out 2 small shapes huddled on the porch just beyond the doorframe. He blinked hard to clear the sting of snow from his eyes. Another pair of kits. No, his mind caught up a second later. Rabbits, both stiff with cold. Dead. She must have left them there before, a hard-won offering. The mother bent and took one gently in her mouth, set it inside the doorway, then repeated the motion with the second. Only when they were both inside did she step fully back into the cabin, shaking the snow from her coat. Sam closed the door, the latch clicking into place against the roar outside. He bent to pick up one of the rabbits. It was freshly killed, the body still flexible, the fur clean. He'd skinned and dressed enough in his time to know these weren't scraps scavenged from some trapper's leavings. She'd hunted them herself, even in this weather. She took them from his hands and carried them to the blanket, laying them beside her kits. The 2 larger ones stirred at the scent, small teeth finding the meat. The smallest only sniffed and closed its eyes again, still too weak to bother. She didn't push it. Instead, she settled beside them and began to eat in slow, measured bites, stopping often to lick the faces of her young. Sam watched from his chair, the coffee cooling in his hand. The way she divided her meal, the care she took to nudge morsels toward the kits, reminded him of long-ago evenings when Mary would set aside the best piece of fish for their boy before taking any for herself. Another long gust hit the cabin, but the sound no longer felt like a threat. In here, the light from the stove threw a golden halo over the blanket, turning the mother's fur to bronze. She looked up once more, catching his eyes in that way she had, steady, measuring, full of something he still couldn't name, without feeling the lump rise in his throat. He didn't break the gaze this time. If there was a message in it, he meant to understand. Chapter 4. The decision to open the door. The night was pressing hard on the cabin now, the light outside swallowed by the storm. The windows rattled with each gust, snow hissing against the panes. The little fire in the stove glowed steady, its warmth pushing back against the cold's insistence. Sam sat in the rocker, with his boots planted wide, hands wrapped around a mug more for the feel of it than the heat. Across from him, the mother bobcat had curled herself around her kits, her tail tucked close, her eyes half closed, but never all the way shut. He could tell she was listening, maybe not to him, but to everything. The creak of the rafters, the sigh of the wind through the stovepipe, the way the snow shifted against the walls. Every so often, her ears would twitch towards some sound only she could hear. That quiet readiness pulled at him. The smallest kit, the one he'd pulled in from the edge of dying, stirred and let out a thin, kitten-sized cry. The mother rose immediately, stepping over the others to check on it, nuzzling its face, then settling beside it to share her warmth. Sam leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching her work. How she used her body like a blanket. How her head dipped and rose with slow, deliberate care. He thought of the figure he'd seen earlier, blurred by snow, moving along the clearing's edge. Whoever it was, they'd been close enough to notice the tracks in front of his cabin. If they'd been out here with a rifle or traps, the bobcat's trail might be as good as a death sentence. The thought made something settle heavy in his chest. The mother bobcat lifted her head then, and their eyes met across the warm space between them. There was no mistaking it this time. There was a question in that gaze, one that waited for an answer. She rose, padded across the rug to the door, and sat, her back straight, her tail curling over her paws. She glanced at the latch, then back at him. It wasn't hard to read. She wanted something more from him than a few hours by the fire. Sam set down his mug and stood. His boots made the old boards creak as he crossed the room. He laid his hand on the latch, feeling the cold metal bite through his skin. The rules he'd lived by all his life flickered through his mind like cards in a dealer's hand. Don't feed the wild. Don't bring it inside. Don't get too close. They'd kept him safe for decades. But here, now, they felt like the wrong kind of armor. Something that kept out more than danger. He slid the latch and pulled the door open. The wind rushed in with a howl, snow spiraling past his face, the night smelling of ice and pine. The bobcat didn't flinch. She stepped to the threshold, looked out, then looked back at him as if to be sure. When he gave a small nod, he didn't even think about doing it. She turned and disappeared into the white. He stood there, the cold cutting into his face, counting his own breaths. A minute passed, then 2. The storm had a way of bending time until it no longer felt like minutes at all. Just as he was about to call himself a fool for letting her out, a shadow took shape in the snow. She reappeared, moving against the wind, and behind her, 2 more small shapes, kits younger than the ones already curled on his floor. Sam's breath caught. These weren't hers. He could tell by the way they stumbled, the way they hesitated at the edge of the porch. Orphans, maybe, lost in the storm. She guided them with nudges of her head, steering them toward the open door. They crossed the threshold one shaky step at a time. Their fur was caked with ice, their eyes wide with exhaustion. The mother waited until they were inside before she followed, her coat dusted white, her breath coming hard. Sam closed the door behind them, sealing the storm out again. The warmth of the cabin closed around them all like a held breath. Without hesitation, the mother herded the newcomers to the blanket where her own kits waited. There was no distinction in how she treated them. She licked them clean, nudged them toward the warm center, let them press their cold little bodies into the tangle of fur and wool. Sam crouched beside her. "You brought them here for me to keep safe, didn't you?" he said quietly. not expecting an answer. But she glanced up at him, and in her eyes, he thought he saw a flash of relief. He fetched another quilt from the foot of his bed and folded it double to lay beside the stove. The new arrivals, too weak to protest, let him tuck it over them. The older kits shifted to make space without a fuss. The whole blanket seemed to breathe as one, the small bodies rising and falling in unison. When he straightened, Sam caught himself looking at the door. Whatever lay out there, hunters, trappers, or just the indifference of the cold, it was no place for them tonight. The decision to open the door had been made, and there would be no taking it back. The mother bobcat lay down again, her head on her paws, her eyes half closed but fixed in his direction. The fire popped in the stove, throwing a soft orange light over the whole scene. It struck him that the line between his world and hers had shifted, not erased, but blurred enough that, for now, they could share the same space without fear. Sam went back to his chair, feeling the weight of the night in his bones. He didn't know how long this strange truce would last, but he knew one thing. Whatever the rules had been, they didn't seem to apply anymore. And for the first time in years, he felt certain that breaking them had been the right call. Chapter 5. The whole family steps. Inside the cabin was warmer now, almost too warm for Sam after the rush of cold that had come with opening the door. He set the latch again, drawing it down until it clicked into place, sealing out the blizzard's constant hiss. Behind him, the floorboards had become a patch of living movement. Tails twitching, paws shifting, the soft rustle of fur on wool. The mother bobcat stood at the center of it, her shoulders high, watching as the newcomers found their place among her original 3 kits. Sam still wasn't sure how they all fit together, whether the smaller pair were distant kin or just strays she'd found in the storm. But the way she nosed them toward the warmest spot, licking the frost from their whiskers, left no doubt. She'd taken them as her own. He stepped closer, moving slow so as not to crowd them. The mother tracked his movement but didn't bristle. That in itself felt like a kind of permission. He crouched to the edge of the blanket and slid the nearest log a little deeper into the stove's belly. The fire answered with a low roar, casting a pulse of light across the room. In that glow, the kits' coats showed their markings, rosettes and faint stripes, like someone had painted them in quick, sure strokes. One of the original kits, braver than the rest, lifted its head to study him. Its ears flicked, its eyes wide but curious rather than afraid. It was the same one that had sniffed at his boot earlier. This time, it took a step forward on tiny, silent paws, then another, until it was close enough to nose the cuff of his pants. He held still, the way he would with a wild bird on a fence rail, letting it decide how far to go. The mother's gaze didn't waver. She was reading him, weighing him, but she didn't call the kit back. That trust, earned in inches, warmed him more than the fire. It was then he remembered the blanket folded on the rocker, the one Mary had stitched by hand from thick, undyed wool. She'd made it in their first winter here, sitting by the stove in the evenings, her fingers working the needle, while the wind carried the sound of the river under ice. They'd wrapped themselves in it during storms like this one, the two of them tucked in with mugs of tea and a single lamp burning low. Sam crossed to the rocker and lifted the blanket. The weight of it in his hands was solid, familiar. He carried it back to the stove and spread it in a second nest beside the first. The mother's head followed his every move, her ears tipping forward when he set it down. "There," he said quietly. "Room enough for everyone." One by one, the kits shuffled toward the new nest, drawn by its softness, and the faint scent of clean wool. The mother waited until the last of them had settled before lying down herself, curling in a loose crescent so that her body touched both blankets, connecting the two groups. Sam realized she'd positioned herself to keep every kit within reach. Outside, the storm's voice rose again, rattling the stovepipe and making the timbers creak. Snow slapped against the windows in bursts, the wind driving it like thrown gravel. Sam knew what that kind of cold could do in minutes. Inside, though, the air was gentle. The circle of heat from the stove spread low and steady, the blankets holding it close. He eased himself back into the rocker. The old chair complained, the sound familiar and comforting. From there, he could see the whole scene. The Bobcat's slow rise and fall of breath, the tiny movements of pause as the kits dreamed, the flick of an ear when the fire popped. His own breathing began to match theirs without him noticing. It struck him then how thin the space was between life and death in a place like this. A shut door, a warm blanket, a steady fire. That was all it took to tip the balance. He thought of what might have happened if he'd turned them away, if that first kit had been left on the porch. The thought made his jaw tighten. The braver kit lifted its head again and looked at him across the small distance. He met its gaze without moving, and after a long moment, it laid its head back down, this time facing him. The gesture was small, but it landed in him like the memory of a handshake, an agreement quietly made. The mother shifted then, tucking her paws under her chest, her eyes still open. She looked toward the door once, then back to him. He wondered if she was listening for something beyond the storm, or if she was just marking the way out. Either way, she didn't rise. Sam let the fire's rhythm fill the silence. He thought of Lucy, trudging home through the white, of the figure he'd glimpsed earlier in the storm, and of how quickly the world could change with a knock or a tap at the door. The wind screamed once more against the cabin walls, but inside, every living thing was wrapped in warmth and watchfulness. He reached for his mug, found it cold, and set it aside without drinking. The heat in the room was enough. In that quiet, with the storm still pressing its weight outside, Sam knew the night had shifted into something rare, a truce between wild and human, drawn close around a stove's orange heart, and for now, that was enough. Chapter 6. The Fire and the Wool Blanket. By the time the clock on the wall marked 7, the wind had settled into a steady roar, the kind that pressed its cold weight against the cabin without pause. Outside was nothing but a churning wall of white. Sam had stopped checking the windows. There was nothing to see except the snow's restless dance and the faint outline of the spruces bowing under it. Inside, the air glowed with firelight, and the soft smell of wood smoke settled deep into the room. The mother bobcat lay curled around her kits on one blanket, the second nest he'd laid down still warm from the stove. The younger two she had brought in last were sleeping heavily, their small sides rising and falling with the rhythm of exhausted bodies, finally safe. Sam sat in the rocker, one boot resting on the rung, watching her. She was awake, though still, her head resting lightly on her paws. Every so often, her eyes would close for a beat too long, only to lift open again, as if she refused to let herself drift off completely. It was then his gaze drifted to the rocker beside him. The rocker that had been Mary's. Her quilt still sat folded on its seat, edges worn soft by years of hands smoothing them flat. She'd pieced it together the first winter they'd come to this cabin, working by lamplight while the river outside was locked under ice. Thick, undyed wool, stitched in wide panels so it could be pulled over both of them when the stove's fire died in the early hours. Sam stood and took the quilt in his hands. The weight of it was familiar, almost like holding her hand again. The scent was faint now, more of cedar from the chest than of her, but it still tightened something in his chest. He carried it over to the stove and shook it out, letting the warmth soak into it. The fire's orange light picked out every line of stitching. When he laid it down, he did so slowly, spreading it beside the mother's currant nest. She lifted her head and watched him with quiet intent. "It's warmer than what you've got," he told her softly. She made it herself. As if she'd understood, the bobcat rose. She stepped over her sleeping young, crossed the short space to the new quilt, and pressed her nose into it. Whatever scent it held seemed to pass her inspection. She circled once, then twice, before settling into it with the slow grace of something that knew the value of comfort. The braver of her original kits followed, pressing itself against her flank. Then another. Soon all of them had shifted, drawn to the deeper warmth of the thick wool. The mother stayed curled so that every kit could rest against her body, her tail draped over the smallest like a sheltering arm. Sam sank back into his chair, the sight filling the cabin with something warmer than fire. He thought of Mary wrapping that same quilt around their son one winter, when he'd fallen asleep on the floor, after reading by the stove. The years seemed to fold in on themselves, past and present pressed close, like the layers of wool. A knock on the door jolted him from the thought. Not the sharp rap of a human hand, but the careful tap of knuckles all the same. He rose, half expecting the wind to have shaken something loose, and opened it just enough to let in a gust of icy air. Lucy stood there, cheeks red, snow clinging to her coat. "Couldn't sleep," she said as she stepped inside. "Kept thinking about those little ones." She peeled off her gloves and moved straight to the stove, holding her hands over the heat. Her eyes went to the quilt on the floor. "That's Mary's, isn't it?" Sam nodded. "Figured it was time it kept somebody warm again." Lucy crouched near the bobcat, keeping her hands clear but close enough to feel the heat radiating off the nest. "They're looking better already," she murmured. Even the tiny one's got some color back in its ears. They worked together without much talk, Lucy warming a bit of honey in a tin lid, Sam steadying the smallest kit so she could coax it to lick. The mother watched, but didn't move to stop them. Trust, Sam thought again, was a slow road, but they were walking it. When the kit finished, Lucy sat back on her heels. "They'll sleep good now." Sam glanced toward the window. The storm's song hadn't changed, but inside, the quilt lay heavy with life. Every breath under it, a quiet argument against the night. For the first time in a long while, he felt the room was full, not just with bodies, but with the kind of warmth that lived in the space between them. He topped off the stove and let the fire settle into its steady pulse. The bobcat lifted her head once, met his eyes, then laid it back down. That was all, and somehow, it was enough. Chapter 7. An Unexpected Visitor. The storm had begun to change its voice by the time midnight came. It no longer struck the cabin in sudden, violent blows, but leaned against it with a steady weight, the wind threading through the trees in long, low notes. Snow still scraped against the windows, though softer now, as if the worst of it had passed. Inside, the room was still and warm, firelight breathing across the walls, the only movement the slow stir of the mother bobcat's tail as she dozed. Sam had tried to rest in his rocker, but his eyes kept wandering to the quilt on the floor. The way the kits were piled together, their spotted coats rising and falling in a shared rhythm, had a way of catching him off guard. He wasn't used to the sight of so much life gathered under his roof, at least not since Mary had gone. He'd nearly drifted off when a sound broke through the quiet. Not the wind, not the creak of settling timbers. This was different, a muffled crunch on the porch boards. His head came up, eyes narrowing toward the door. The mother bobcat was awake instantly. Her head rose, ears pricked, eyes locked on the same spot he was watching. She didn't growl, didn't move toward the door, but her body tensed in a way that told him she knew the sound, and it wasn't one she trusted. Sam set his boots quietly on the floor, rising with care. He crossed to the window and rubbed a small patch clear in the frost. The glow from the porch light was weak in the storm's haze, but enough to make out a figure standing just beyond it. The shape was bundled in a heavy coat, the hood drawn tight. Whoever it was didn't knock. He eased the door open a crack, bracing against the cold that swept in. "Evening," he called, voice steady. The figure stepped forward, snow crunching under their boots. As they came into the light, Sam saw the face, gaunt, windburned, with a few days' worth of beard. A stranger. "Sorry to bother you," the man said, his breath coming in clouds. "Got caught out in this mess. I saw your light." Sam's eyes flicked past him to the tree line. "You out here alone?" The man hesitated just long enough for Sam to notice. "Hunting," he said. "Lost my way when the weather turned." The mother bobcat hadn't moved from the quilt, but her eyes never left the door. One of the kits stirred under her, sensing the tension. Sam kept his voice even. "Come in. Warm up." The stranger stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes roved over the cabin, pausing when they landed on the quilted pile near the stove. He didn't speak, but the look was too sharp for simple curiosity. Sam shut the door and moved between the man and the bobcats without making it obvious. "Coffee's on the stove," he said, nodding toward the kettle. "Pour yourself some." The man did, though his eyes kept flicking toward the blanket. "Don't see many folks keep wild animals inside," he said finally. "They came to the door half frozen," Sam replied. "Storm like this, you don't turn anything away." The man's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's so." Lucy's voice came from the back room, where she'd been checking on the smallest kit. "Sam, you—" She stopped short when she saw the stranger. "Evening, ma'am," the man said, tipping his head. Lucy's eyes moved to Sam, a question in them he didn't answer aloud. Instead, he said, "This is Lucy Harper, my neighbor. Lucy, this fella got caught in the storm." The man nodded once, took a sip of coffee, and glanced at the window. "Looks like it's letting up some. I should be on my way." Sam didn't stop him, but he watched as the man pulled his hood back up and stepped out into the snow. He closed the door firmly behind him, setting the latch with a quiet finality. When he turned back, Lucy was still watching him. "You didn't believe his story," she said. "No," Sam admitted. "And I don't think the bobcat did either." They both looked toward the quilt. The mother's eyes were still fixed on the door, the firelight catching in them like two small, steady flames. She didn't relax until several minutes had passed, and the only sounds were the wind's slow song and the crackle of the fire. Sam went to the stove, added another log, and let the heat swell into the room. Whatever that visit had been, it felt like the start of something, and not the kind you could ignore. Lucy crouched beside the quilt, adjusting its edge over the smallest kit. "We'll keep them safe," she said, but her voice had the tone of someone who knew it might not be easy. Sam nodded. "We will," he said, but in his mind the picture of the stranger's eyes lingered, along with the way they'd measured the small breathing heap by the fire. The storm might be breaking, but trouble, he knew, could travel on quieter winds. Chapter 8. A calm unlike the wild. By morning, the worst of the storm had passed. The wind had eased to a whisper, brushing the cabin walls as if testing the strength it had battered all night. Light, pale and thin, filtered through the frost-caked windows. Sam stirred the coals in the stove, letting the fire wake with a low rumble. The room warmed slowly, the air smelling of ash and cedar. The mother bobcat was already awake, her head lifted, eyes bright in the dim light. The quilt at her side rose and fell with the steady breathing of 6 small bodies, her original 3 and the 2 orphans she'd brought in during the night, plus the tiniest one still recovering by the stove. Sam had expected more noise, more movement by now, but the room stayed hushed, except for the occasional snap from the fire. Lucy stepped out from the back room where she'd slept on the cot, wrapping her sweater tighter. "They didn't stir once while I was back there," she said quietly. "Not a scratch, not a sound." Sam nodded. Wild things don't usually act this way indoors. They're supposed to pace, claw, try for the door. Yet these kits stayed close to their mother, eyes flicking now and then towards Sam and Lucy, but never filled with fear. Even when Sam crouched to refill the water dish, none of them shrank away. One of the older kits blinked slowly at him, its ears twitching, as though it were listening to the low hum of his voice. He found himself speaking to them without thinking. "Morning's a better one than last night, isn't it?" His tone was even, almost the same as when he'd talked to Mary in the quiet hours before dawn. The mother's gaze followed him as he moved, but there was no tension in it now. It was watchful, yes, but not sharp. She licked the head of the smallest kit, then stretched her neck toward Lucy, who was kneeling to fold the extra blanket they'd used on the floor. The gesture was subtle, but Sam caught it. The same tilt she'd given him when she'd asked to bring the orphans inside. Lucy smiled faintly. "She's talking to us." Sam didn't answer right away. He was remembering the stranger from the night before, the way his eyes had lingered on the bobcats. The man's face kept coming back to him, even as he watched this scene of quiet trust unfolding in his cabin. One of the kits, the boldest of the bunch, climbed over its siblings and padded toward Lucy. Its steps were careful, but sure. Lucy stayed still, letting it come as close as it dared. When it reached her knee, it sniffed at her hand, then turned in a slow circle before settling right there against her leg. "That's not normal," Sam murmured. Lucy tilted her head, brushing her fingers lightly over the kit's back. It is for them now. They spent the next hour tending to the family. Sam thawed small strips of venison from his stores, laying them on a tin plate by the stove. The mother bobcat approached with no rush, took a piece gently in her mouth, and carried it back to her kits. She didn't eat herself until they were each chewing their own. It was an order, a discipline, that made Sam think of a unit on the trail. Each member looked after in turn, before the leader rested. The smallest kit still refused solid food, so Lucy warmed honey again, holding the tiny head in her palm while it licked. Sam saw the mother's ears tilt forward, her body leaning just slightly toward them, but she made no move to interfere. If anything, her tail twitched once in a way that felt almost like approval. Outside, the pale light was brightening into something closer to day. Through the small clear patch Sam had rubbed in the frost, he could see the trees standing heavy with snow, their branches bending but unbroken. For the first time in days, the horizon was visible, thin blue slicing between earth and sky. Lucy followed his gaze. "It's beautiful when it's not trying to kill you." He chuckled, the sound low. "That's Alaska for you." They turned back to the fire. The cabin felt fuller than it had in years. Not crowded, full. Each quiet movement from the bobcats seemed to knit the air tighter, like the threads of Mary's quilt drawn close over old bones. Sam knew this calm couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the wild would call them back, or trouble would come looking again. But for now, He let himself lean back in the rocker, listening to the slow, steady breathing of the family at his feet. When the mother finally stretched out her front legs and laid her head on the floorboards, it was the most relaxed he'd seen her. Her eyes closed fully for the first time since she'd stepped into his home. The kits shifted, one climbing onto her back, another curling under her chin. Lucy glanced at Sam, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think she knows they're safe here." Sam nodded slowly. "And I think she wants us to remember it." For a while they sat in companionable silence, the fire holding its steady pulse, the outside world held at bay. It wasn't just calm, it was a kind of truce. And deep down, Sam wondered if the mother Bobcat had chosen them as much as they had chosen to open the door. Chapter 9. Life stirring again. The fire had burned down to a deep bed of coals, the kind that held their heat like a secret. Sam added 2 more splits of spruce, watching them catch slow and bright. The smell of resin drifted up, mingling with the familiar tang of metal from the stove. It was a comfort he'd known for decades, but this morning it carried something new. The low hum of life returning to the smallest creature in the room. The tiniest kit had been curled near the stove since the night he'd carried it in from the porch, limp as a discarded glove. Now, as Sam leaned on one knee beside it, he could see movement that wasn't just breathing. Its paws flexed, curling and uncurling as though testing their grip on the world again. When he slid a finger gently along its side, the kitten stirred, stretching in a shaky arc. "Look here," he called quietly over his shoulder. Lucy came from the back room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Well, I'll be—" She crouched beside him, her smile small but real, colors coming back in its nose. They warmed a bit of honey in a tin lid again. Lucy steadied the tiny head while Sam let a drop touch its mouth. The pink tongue flicked out, then again with more intent. Within minutes, the kit was licking steadily, the sound almost comically loud in the quiet cabin. The mother bobcat rose from the quilt at the first sound and crossed the floor in a few easy strides. She lowered her head until her whiskers brushed the back of Sam's hand. Her eyes were close now, the gold in them bright, even in the dim morning. She sniffed the kit, then looked up at him briefly, just long enough for him to feel the weight of that gaze, before returning to her nest. Lucy chuckled softly. "I think you got yourself approved." Sam set the kit gently onto the wool blanket beside its siblings. The others shifted, making space without a fuss. One of the older ones even licked its ear as if to say, "You're back where you belong." The mother settled herself in a way that tucked every kit against her. 6 bodies now, breathing as one under the steady heat of the stove. Sam straightened, rolling his shoulders against the stiffness, but his eyes kept drifting back to that small pile. He could feel something loosening in him, something he hadn't known was clenched. Outside, the pale light of the morning had sharpened, showing the aftermath of the storm. Snow lay thick and clean over the clearing, draped over fence posts and the low slope toward the creek. Animal tracks pocked the smooth surface, mostly rabbits, a fox or 2, but no sign of boots. Sam felt a quiet relief at that. Lucy noticed his glance. "You were expecting to see someone?" "Just making sure I don't," he said. He didn't explain more. They spent the next hour in a rhythm that felt older than the cabin itself. Sam tended the fire, Lucy prepared small bits of meat, and the bobcats moved between rest and feeding without fuss. It struck him that the room had taken on a kind of shared pulse, each of them moving in response to the others without needing to speak. When the boldest kit wandered toward him again, He held out a hand. To his surprise, it stepped onto his boot, balanced there for a moment, then leapt lightly to the rug. He could feel the faint press of its claws through the leather, testing, but not harming. "You're pushing the line," he murmured, not unkindly. Lucy grinned. "Or crossing it." The mother didn't so much as lift her head. That, more than anything, told Sam the distance between them had changed. He poured himself coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the cool edge of the room. Sitting back in his chair, he let the rocker find its slow rhythm. Through the window, he could see the tree line etched against a pale sky. The quiet after a storm so complete it almost rang in his ears. The smallest kit, full from its honey and warm from the stove, let out a sound halfway between a sigh and a purr. Sam's chest tightened at the sound. It was small, almost nothing, and yet it was the clearest sign that the fight back to life was being won. Lucy caught his eye over the top of her mug. "You know they won't stay here forever." "I know." He didn't say that a part of him wished they could. The fire popped, sending a brief shower of sparks against the stove's door. The mother bobcat shifted, curling her body tighter around the kits. Sam studied her profile in the firelight. The calm there, the readiness still coiled under it. She was resting now, but she would always be ready to move when the time came. He took another sip of coffee and let the warmth sit in his chest. For the moment, the storm was gone, the danger distant, and the smallest life in the room was breathing stronger. That was enough to count as a victory in a winter like this. But even as he thought it, his mind slid back to the stranger from the night before, to the way those eyes had measured the bobcats. He didn't know when or how, but he was sure that man hadn't stumbled into his clearing by accident. For now, though, the room held only the steady sound of breathing, the low hum of the stove, and the faint thrum of a tiny heartbeat under a quilt made by loving hands long ago. Sam let himself listen, committing it to memory against the day when the sound would be gone. Chapter 10. Words between the quiet. By mid-afternoon, the sun had managed to push a pale glow through the frost-caked windows. It wasn't much warmth, but it cast a softer light across the cabin. The fire was steady now, the stove radiating the kind of heat that sank deep into your bones. Sam sat in the rocker, boots flat on the braided rug, a fresh mug of coffee warming his hands. Across from him, Lucy was on the low stool she'd pulled up beside the quilt, her back to the stove, and her eyes on the sleeping kits. For a long while, neither of them spoke. It was the sort of silence that didn't need to be broken, not the empty kind, but the full kind, where both people knew the other's mind was circling the same thoughts. The mother bobcat lay stretched, so her body touched every one of the kits, her flank rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. Her ears twitched now and then, but her eyes stayed closed. Lucy finally broke the quiet. "You ever think about how easy it is to forget we share this place?" Sam looked up from his coffee. "You mean, with the wild?" She nodded. "It's their home, too. We act like it's ours alone, but out there—" She tilted her head toward the snow-muffled forest beyond the wall. "We're just tenants." Sam let the words settle. "Most folks don't want to remember that. Easier to think we're in charge." Lucy smiled faintly. "And you? You've been in this cabin near 30 years. What do you think?" He took a slow sip before answering. "I think I've been lucky. Lucky to see things most folks don't. But that also means I've seen what happens when we forget the wild has its own rules." Lucy's eyes flicked to the bobcats. "This here," she gestured lightly toward them, "feels like we've been invited into their rules for a change." Sam leaned back in the rocker. "Feels that way to me too." The boldest kit stirred then, lifting its head to blink at Lucy. She didn't move, and after a moment it stretched, stepping carefully over its siblings until it reached her knee. It sat there for a beat, then curled up against her shin, as if it had known her all its life. "Guess I'm in too," Lucy said softly, a smile tugging at her mouth. Sam chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Looks like you passed the test." They sat in companionable quiet again, the fire's pop and hiss the only sounds. Sam's gaze wandered to the window, to the trail that led away from the cabin. The snow lay untouched, except for the faint tracks of a rabbit cutting across it. No human footprints. Still, the image of the stranger's eyes from 2 nights before kept surfacing, uninvited. Lucy noticed his faraway look. "You're thinking about that man again." "Hard not to," Sam admitted. "He wasn't just lost. You saw it too." She nodded. "I've seen that kind of look. It's the look of someone who's measuring what you've got, not just passing through." Sam's jaw tightened. And now he knows there's something here worth coming back for. The mother bobcat opened her eyes then, lifting her head just enough to look toward the door. It was a small thing, but Sam didn't miss it. She laid her head back down without a sound, yet the motion had the feel of a warning. Lucy shifted on the stool. "If he does come back, he'll find he's not the only one keeping watch," Sam said. His tone was quiet, but the weight in it was plain. They let the subject drop, though it stayed in the room with them, unspoken, but solid as the logs stacked by the stove. The smallest kit gave a contented sigh, burrowing deeper into the quilt. The mother bobcat followed the movement with a slow blink, then closed her eyes again. Sam watched her for a long time, feeling the strange thread that had woven between them over the last 2 days. It was more than just her trust. It was the sense that they were part of the same moment in time, bound by the same storm, the same fragile edge between danger and safety. Lucy poured herself another cup of coffee, breaking the quiet with the soft clink of the pot against her mug. "You ever think," she said slowly, "that maybe they found us, not the other way around?" Sam's eyes stayed on the quilt. "I'm starting to." Outside, the wind had gone still. The world beyond the cabin was holding its breath, the snow-laden trees standing in perfect stillness. Inside, the fire held its steady glow. The bobcats slept without fear, and for now, the trouble that might be coming stayed out where it belonged. Sam leaned back in the rocker, letting its old rhythm carry him. Whatever came next, he knew this much. He and Lucy would stand for these creatures as long as they needed him to. And if the stranger came back, he'd find more than just a man and his neighbor waiting. He'd find a line drawn, quiet but unshakable, across the threshold of this small cabin in the Alaskan snow. Chapter 11. The hour to go. The third morning after the storm broke clear and bright, the sky a hard, endless blue. Sunlight spilled through the frost on the windows, throwing shards of light across the cabin floor. Outside, the snow lay smooth and high, glittering in the cold. The kind of morning that could fool a man into thinking it was gentler than it was, until you stepped out and felt the air bite your skin. Sam was already up, moving slow so as not to disturb the sleeping bundle on the quilt. The fire had burned low in the night, but he'd kept it alive, feeding it small logs every few hours. He set another piece of spruce in the stove, listened to it catch, and felt the warmth begin to creep back into the room. The mother bobcat stirred first, lifting her head and blinking against the light. Her ears swiveled toward the window, then to the door. She stayed still for a long moment, the kind of stillness that was more decision than rest. Then she rose, stretching each leg in turn, her breath puffing faint in the coldest corners of the room. Sam watched her, sensing the shift before she moved toward the door. The kits followed her with their eyes, but didn't rise right away. They seemed to know something was different. Lucy came in from the back room, hair pulled into a braid, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She caught sight of the Bobcat by the door and stopped. "She's thinking about leaving." "Feels that way," Sam said. The mother turned her head toward him, holding his gaze. It wasn't the first time she'd looked at him like that, but there was something final in it now. A steady weight, as if she was memorizing his face the way he'd been memorizing hers. The smallest kit rose unsteadily, padding toward the stove before stopping to glance back at her. She waited, patient but unmoving, until every one of them was on their feet. One by one, they crossed the floor to stand near her, their paws soundless on the boards. Sam felt something tighten in his chest. "You sure about this?" he murmured, though he knew she was. He crossed to the door, pulled on his gloves, and lifted the latch. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it the sharp scent of pine and snow. The light outside was blinding after the dim warmth of the cabin. The mother stepped to the threshold, the kits bunching behind her. They hesitated, their paws sinking into the fresh drift. She looked back once, not in doubt, but in acknowledgement. Sam knelt without thinking, holding out a gloved hand toward the smallest kit. It took 2 steps toward him, then stopped, nose twitching. He reached out slowly, brushed his fingers once along its side, and let his hand drop. "Go on now," he said softly. The mother moved forward, each step deliberate. The kits followed, their tracks a neat line in the untouched snow. Sam and Lucy stood in the doorway, the cold seeping through their coats, watching until the line began to blur into the white distance. Halfway to the trees, the mother stopped. She turned, scanning back toward the cabin. Then, in a motion so deliberate it startled him, she padded back across the snow until she stood just in front of him. She lifted one paw and set it lightly against his arm. Not a claw extended, just the soft weight of her touch. Her eyes met his, gold in the sunlight, steady, unblinking. It lasted no more than a breath, but it felt longer. A moment stretched thin enough to hold everything they had shared in these few days. Then she stepped back, turned, and walked to her waiting kits. Sam stayed in the doorway until they disappeared into the line of spruce, their shapes folding into shadow and light until the clearing was empty again. The silence that followed was deep, the kind that lives in the snow itself. Lucy touched his shoulder. "They'll remember." He nodded, though his throat was tight. "So will I." Inside, the cabin felt bigger than it had with the Bobcats in it, the space they'd filled now echoing. The quilt lay where they'd left it, creased and warm from their bodies. Sam crossed to it, lifted it from the floor, and folded it slowly, smoothing the edges with his hands. He set it back on Mary's rocker, where it caught the sunlight and held it like a keepsake. Outside, the wind shifted in the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound, a branch cracking under snow, or perhaps the ghost of movement through the drifts. Sam stood at the window for a long time, eyes on the place where the trail had vanished, the image of gold eyes and a lifted paw still burning in his mind. For the first time in years, he realized, the cabin had been more than just shelter. It had been a bridge between two worlds, if only for a short time. And now, with the fire steady and the door closed, he felt the warmth they'd left behind, lingering in the quiet like a promise. Chapter 12. Footprints in the snow. The clearing stayed empty the rest of that day. The sun climbed high, sending sharp beams through the pines and setting the snow to glitter, but no flicker of movement broke the stillness beyond the cabin windows. Sam busied himself with small chores, bringing in more firewood, mending a worn strap on his snowshoes, yet every so often he'd find his eyes drawn back to the tree line. It wasn't that he expected to see them again so soon. It was just that the sight of that space, bare now of fur and gold eyes, had a way of pulling him in. Lucy came by in the afternoon with a jar of stew she'd made, the kind thick enough to hold a spoon straight up. She set it on the counter and poured herself a mug of coffee without asking. They ate at the table by the window, steam from the bowls curling in the sunlight. "They'll be fine," she said between bites. "They had a head start on the storm, and they've got her. That mother, she's all grit and sense." Sam nodded, but didn't answer right away. "It's not their safety I'm worried about. Not entirely, anyway." He was thinking of the stranger's face, the way those eyes had marked the Bobcats, like a man measuring fur on the hoof. Lucy followed his gaze toward the trees. "If he comes back, he'll find you ready." Sam let that settle. Ready. Yes, but there was more to it than that. He wasn't just braced to keep something out. He felt as though he was holding something in too, something worth protecting that had brushed his life and moved on. The next morning dawned colder, the kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp in your nose. Sam stepped outside to check the woodpile. The snow in the clearing was smooth again, except for a faint line of prints leading in from the pines, smaller than a deer's, lighter than a fox's. He followed them a few paces and crouched, his glove brushing the edges of the tracks. Bobcat for sure, and not just one. The prints didn't come all the way to the porch. They stopped halfway across the clearing, milled a little, then turned back toward the woods. He straightened, eyes scanning the shadowed spaces between trunks. Nothing moved, but he couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. He stood there longer than he meant to, until the cold began to sting his ears. Finally, he raised a hand. Not a wave exactly, more a small, steady gesture, and then turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the quilt was still on Mary's rocker. He'd left it there, folded neat, but it looked somehow different now, as if it had gathered a little of the warmth it had held just days before. He ran a hand along the top fold, the wool thick under his palm. For the rest of the day, he went about his work, the thought of those tracks warming him more than the fire. He imagined them out there, finding shelter, hunting, moving together through the quiet white. The smallest kit would be stronger now, quick enough to keep up. He pictured the mother pausing to look back over her shoulder, scanning the horizon like she'd done so many times in his cabin, making sure her family was together before moving on. That night, the wind came up again, rattling the stovepipe, but it was nothing like the storm that had driven them to his door. Sam sat in the rocker, a book open on his knee, though he barely read a page. His mind kept replaying the sound of claws tapping on wood, the moment the threshold had filled with fur and frost and quiet courage. He knew he'd tell the story in years to come, about the day a wild mother asked for help, and how for a handful of winter days, two worlds shared the same fire. But he also knew there were parts of it he wouldn't put into words. The weight of a paw on his arm, the silent understanding in a pair of gold eyes, the way the cabin had felt fuller for their presence, and somehow not empty when they were gone. When he banked the fire for the night, he took one last look out the window. The moon had risen, silvering the snow and turning the tree shadows long and sharp. Somewhere out there, a shape moved, too far to see clearly, but enough to make his breath catch. A pause, a turn of the head, then it melted back into the trees. Sam smiled to himself. A slow, deep thing. They hadn't really gone, not in the way that mattered. The wild had its own way of keeping connections, and now, so did he. In the stillness that followed, with the cabin wrapped in quiet, and the fire whispering low, he settled into the rocker, the quilt close by, and felt the warmth they'd left behind. Something that would outlast the winter. Something he'd carry as surely as their tracks in the snow. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments, so I know you were here. And if you want to be part of the next incredible journey between man and the wild, make sure to hit subscribe. There are more stories coming, ones you won't want to miss.